In part 2 of this deep dive, I'll be deconstructing Act 2 of Will Tracy's Oscar-nominated screenplay for Bugonia. So Act 2 officially starts around page 23. And I think that the most logical place to divide the acts is where it says tight close up on Michelle as she comes to and her eyelids flutter. I think this is a natural transition because this mirrors something in Act 1. If you remember, in Act 1, we meet Michelle by her opening her eyes right before her alarm goes off. In complete control, she has all the power and all the control in the world. It's very telling of who Michelle is as a character. This time around, she opens her eyes and presumably has no leverage, no control, and no power. She's locked up and chained up in the basement. So that is Will Tracy signposting a change in circumstances. So now we are officially in Act 2, and we establish the second status quo. The Act 1 turn, the lock, has changed the world significantly for all the characters involved, which means we have to establish the new ordinary world. Michelle comes to, and Teddy and Don are there. And what this scene is doing is it's setting up a change in the characters for purposes of developing their arcs. How you set up an arc, right? You have a thematic question for the film, and each character has an initial answer to that question. In Bugonia, I'd argue that the question is, can we remove ourselves from the pain that we inflict on others? And each character has an initial answer to that question. Tied to that answer are their strategies, what they do, why they do what they do, and how they do it. You can't really have an arc in Act 1 because Act 1, nothing changes, right? It's the change that sparks the arc. And so when we enter into Act 2, the juice, the meat of the movie, that's when characters start to show whether or not they're going to change and whether or not they're going to have an arc, a positive, a negative, a tragic, or a flat arc. At the beginning of Act 2, the characters may have changed circumstances, but their worldviews haven't changed. And so what you would expect in a well-written script is that as these things happen, the characters maintain their initial strategies. They maintain their initial attitudes towards things. So even though Michelle is locked up in a basement, she's still going to use the same strategies that she used before she was locked up. The domination, the control, the manipulation. Teddy is going to employ the same strategies that he had in Act 1 as well. Manipulation, conspiracy talk, denial, disruption, all of those things. And Dawn is going to remain kind of neutral and a little scared, but loyal to Teddy. That's what you would expect in the new status quo. Let's see if Will Tracy pulls it off. So in this first interaction, Teddy's doing something kind of weird, right? The way that he's talking is this kind of he's falling back into this, like, what he thinks he's supposed to sound like if he was in some sort of a sci-fi novel. And so, you know, for instance, he says, "Greetings, this is my home," and "Welcome to the headquarters of the human resistance." And he's talking in this really weird kind of formal way as he's dressed in this suit. We talked about it last time. This is performance, right? This is all performance art. Like, this is not who Teddy is. Teddy's going to portray who he is based on this interaction with Michelle because he can't help it, but he's putting on this sort of like mask of formal humanity. Michelle's ignoring all of it, right? She's like, "What's happened? What happened? You know, what? You shaved my head." And of course, Teddy says something very dehumanizing. He says, "Your hair has been destroyed," rather than cut or shaved off, because Teddy is distancing himself from any possibility of Michelle being a human. And so very quickly, Teddy just says, "Hey, we know you're an alien," and Michelle is kind of like, "What the fuck is going on here?" And so here on page 25 is where the dynamic starts to shift. Good conflict comes from opposing worldviews and strategies. But a good scene acts very similar to how you would write a good fight scene. Action, reaction, escalation. So it's about leverage. Who has the power? Who has the leverage? If this was a fight, it would be Teddy has the power, then Michelle counters, and now she has the leverage, she has the power, and then they react and they escalate. That's to keep the scene from becoming repetitive, to keep the beats from feeling redundant, to keep the audience interested, and to escalate the tension all of the time. And remember, the purpose of all of these scenes leading up through Act 2A into the midpoint of the movie is to continue to apply pressure on each character to always go back to the thematic question to see if their answer to the question is changing, because that is what the arc is. So all of these exchanges, all of these scenes force the characters to ask, can I remove myself from the pain that I inflict on others? And very quickly on page 25, Michelle takes control. She says, listen to me, listen to me. I said, listen to me. And those are her strategies. She is still the same person she was before her hair was shaved. Teddy, as much as he wants to project power, still, from a status perspective, he thinks that he's lesser, which is why he's putting on these airs, right? Like acting, puffing his chest out. And so he becomes subservient very quickly. He says, I'm listening. And then Michelle goes into this whole, monologue about what's going to happen. And she talks to him the same way that she would talk to a child or to one of her employees. So here's what's going to happen. I want to be clear that I'm not threatening you, okay? The following is just my best guess at how the next 48 hours is likely to transpire. Do you understand? Like that, the do you understand is very, CEO condescending. If you've ever had a boss who said help me understand, or that's what this is. This is very much like leadership training 101. And Teddy says, I understand, because he's falling back into his, passive attitude. This is the shift in power that I'm talking about. One thing that Will Tracy does here, and this is his voice, you don't want to take away the author's voice, the writer's voice. He says, she has encountered plenty of radicals like Teddy in her long and brilliant career, and she knows just how to deal with them. How are you going to show that on screen, right? That is clear, overwriting, kind of flowery writing. Will Tracy can get away with it because it's part of who he is and it's part of his voice. It's the gravy, as I say. But if you're a writer and you're writing for competition or for coverage, this is the kind of thing that would be flagged as, it's a little too cute. The same with this long monologue that is not broken up. I call this an I page, right? Where the entire page is just dialogue and it looks like the letter I. That is hard to digest for modern readers. They want it broken up by either parentheticals or action or something, because they're going to look at this and be like, ugh, I have to read through all of this. It's an unfortunate reality of how readers quickly scan scripts, because they have so many scripts to go through, and you don't want to give readers a reason to say no to your material. She gives the same false choice to Teddy that she gives to her employees about leaving at 5:30. She says, I am not in charge of the situation in this room. You are. But you are not in charge of what's happening out there. And so it's the same illusion, the same strategy, the same worldview. She hasn't changed as a person. And for a moment it works, right? Teddy is clearly, it says, close on Teddy, who is clearly intimidated by her poise. But then he takes a beat and a deep breath, and he shifts. Wow, that was really good, he says. And Michelle is confused now, because usually these tactics of hers work. And Teddy now takes control. So here we are, shifting control, right? Where we're taking the leverage, we're taking the power, the dynamic, and we started with Teddy, then we went to Michelle, and now we're back to Teddy. And Teddy just shrugs everything off. And he says, man, you really got a human response out of me. That's an interesting line, because he's talking about Michelle being an alien and that her act got a human response out of him. But it's a human response out of him, because he's the one who's acting without humanity, even though he won't acknowledge that, because this whole movie's about blame shifting. You got a human response out of me, the person who we find out later has done all these inhumane things. And then he says, nothing you say is the truth. This is his worldview and strategy locked in, like it was in Act 1. He knows the truth. He's the only one who knows the truth. And he's setting Michelle up for failure. This sets up the next scene. And all good screenplay should be a domino effect, right? Each scene should boom, 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 lead into the next scene until you hit the midpoint, where I call the midpoint explosion, where something radical changes or happens and just destroys everybody's plans and, everybody's ideas of what the world actually is and what their strategies are. So he's setting her up for failure, even though we don't know that. And Michelle is still holding on to her old strategies. She says, let's unpack the problem here. That CEO speak. And Teddy says, whoa, fuck that, right? Unpack that, unpack that, some heady shit right there. And he's like, I'm not going to fall for this CEO bullshit. I'm not one of your employees. I'm not your driver. I'm not your secretary. But the point here, when he launches into this little dialogue of his own, is that he and Michelle are speaking the same language. They're just using different words, and they live in different spheres. Conspiracy sphere, CEO sphere. But they're speaking the same language. Usually I would say that this scene is a little underwritten because we don't know where Dawn is. You always want to keep track of all of the characters in your scene because you don't want them getting lost in the shuffle. But Dawn is by design in the background watching as if it's a tennis match because he doesn't have a position. He's just loyal to Teddy and he's scared. And so it makes sense that we don't cut to Don or he doesn't say anything. So in this scene it works, but as a writer, keep in mind, if you have multiple people in a scene, don't lose track of them because what are they going to do on camera? They're just going to stand there? Like, what are they going to do? And that's going to get flagged as underwriting, like you didn't think it through. On page 28, Teddy tells Michelle what mission 1 of Act 2 is. We need you to bring us to your mothership on the night of the lunar eclipse to broker a sit down with your royal superiors. How's that for fucking unpacked enough for you? So that's the goal. That's the mission. That's why they kidnapped her. That's why she's chained in the basement. Bring us to the mothership. It also introduces a ticking clock, which is the lunar eclipse. And we're going to see title cards as we count down to the lunar eclipse. It adds tension, it adds suspense, it adds a ending. We know that when the lunar eclipse comes, that has to be the end of our story. So it gives the audience something to look for and track as they go through the film. It's a very good device. And again, Michelle falls back. Just like I said, she says, I hear where you're coming from. I hear where you're coming from. Right? That's leadership training shit. And if you've ever worked in like an office building and you've had a supervisor who's gone through like basic supervisor training, I've done this myself. You're told to, acknowledge what your subordinates are saying to you, even if you disagree with them, which is what she does. I hear you, but here's what we're going to do. And that happens in office environments all the time. So they're going through this back and forth, and it says, for a brief moment, and this is important, for a brief moment, we see a flash of rage in Teddy's eyes. Aside from the kidnapping so far and the chemical castration, which is a different kind of violation, a different kind of violence, we haven't seen Teddy get violent. We've seen him get upset, but we haven't seen him get angry or violent. This flash of rage is a precursor. It's a preview of what's to come with Teddy. And even for Don, the next line is on Don, who has the opposite reaction, a look of doubt. So now you've got opposing worldviews. Even though it's in action and not in dialogue, it's still on the screen. This look of doubt versus this look of rage, that creates tension between our two kidnappers, our two cousins. That keeps the scene alive, because obviously Michelle has the opposite reaction as well. So she gets the tape recorder, and Teddy says they're going to give her the night to think it over. And he says on page 29, you'll give this to your emperor. I don't know if this is intentional. Maybe this is intentional. Maybe it's the way that I read this is as intentional gender bias. This is Will Tracy not only putting status and socioeconomic kind of tropes into, the characters, but a little bit of gender bias, because Teddy can't even consider the possibility that Michelle is royalty, right? Even though she's the CEO of a company, she can't be all that important intergalactically. It has to be a man. The emperor can't be an empress. It has to be an emperor. It has to be a boy. I think there's a little bit of gender bias there. Maybe I'm reading too much into it. I don't know. And then Michelle uses a trigger word here, but we don't know it yet. This is Will Tracy being very clever with his setup and payoff. She says, look, can we have a dialogue here? Because you're asking me to do what you're asking me to do isn't clear to me. Can we have a dialogue? And that triggers Teddy. And Will Tracy says she may flinch slightly. I think this is because Will Tracy was writing for a director. He knew this was going to be directed, so this isn't him talking to a blind reader. He's saying she might flinch slightly. I don't know. It's up to you. Whatever you think the proper response would be. I trust you. It's in the hands of a good director, whoever that turns out to be. So Michelle saying, let's have a dialogue, takes us to Teddy saying, I want you to know this is difficult for me. You killed my family, you killed my coworkers and my community, you killed the bees. So given that, you should respect how super professional I'm being right now by not gutting you. That whole thing is crazy, that little speech right there, because of how much is contained in that section. You have the trauma, you have this weird setup of you killed my family and my coworkers. At this point in the story, we don't even know what that means. It just seems like, is he talking like globally or is he being specific? And then he says, you killed the bees, which is a funny line. This is Will Tracy's satire, dripping in, and it's funny, and you're already on edge, and then you killed the bees is like you kind of like chuckle because of how uncomfortable it is, and Michelle's like, the fuck are you talking about? But then he says, I'm being professional by not gutting you. Escalation, the look of rage in Teddy's eyes, and then by not gutting you is such a scary thing to say that Teddy is slowly escalating rhetoric from looks to threats, and we'll see what happens physically later. Good writing. Then Teddy falls back into this weirdly clinical, your sustenance and waste disposal will be attended to in the morning. Who the fuck talks like that, right? This is him again falling back into performance art. And that's pretty much the end of their first interaction together. And then because just like in the first act where Teddy and Dawn are standing between the hardware store and the toy store, right? Being an adult and being a child, they did this very adult, very horrible thing. And the second they leave, when they're alone together, they act like little kids and they're hugging and they're jumping around and they're, like super, because they did it. Yay. Right. We planned this kid now and we did it. Hooray. And so it just, it shows this, it juxtaposes this childish nature with this, terrible thing that they're doing. And that's Will Tracy reminding you of who is doing this and who's capable of this. And it's a commentary of like, are we, whoever we are, capable of doing this? Or can we remove ourselves from the pain that we inflict on others? So now on page 31, we have a major character escalation for Teddy. Even if it was human, and it's not, it's still evil, pure corporate evil. I've studied it for years. Teddy is considering that she's not an alien, but he's still going to do everything that he's doing. And remember that we've set up that there's this object in the basement with a sheet over it to create mystery. What is that thing? We know it's going to come into play because you don't have that there. You don't draw attention to it and not use it. But now Teddy's saying it doesn't really matter if she's an alien. Fuck her. She's still evil. That's not good enough for Dawn. So Dawn says, yeah, but still. And Teddy doubles down, more conspiracy talk. And Dawn's like, yeah, but she is an alien, right? Because she has to be. For Dawn, she has to be an alien because he's not inhuman. He's not a monster. He's not Teddy. So Teddy, being manipulative, says, yes, of course. Of course she's an alien, and she wants you to feel bad for her. It has mastered the art of emotional manipulation. Irony, because he has mastered the art of emotional manipulation. And Dawn falls back on his strategies because it's the beginning of Act 2. For apologizing. I'm sorry. I promise I won't mess this up. He's loyal to Teddy. All of those things are back into play. So this is our status quo. We've established now where we are, and no one has changed how they think of things. But we're within our first mission. So everything is on track. Will Tracy is he's adhering to proper screenplay architecture. He's not messing around with it because he doesn't have to, because he has enough character and theme to place on top and enough gravy to drizzle on top to make this feel fresh, even though it's a formula. And that's really great writing. But buried within this scene is Dawn, once again, giving Teddy a way out. He says, I wish I could fix everything that's happened to you, Teddy. It's so sad. Dawn is there because he just wants Teddy to be better, to feel better, to not be sad. We don't know exactly what's happened to him yet, but we're getting glimpses, and we're going to eventually, pretty soon, be introduced to the B story of Casey and the B story, the background of his mom in an interesting way, which I'll get to. But this is Dawn being human. This is Dawn trying to reach Teddy on an emotional level. He doesn't hear it. And remember, I said in the first video, Teddy's arc is flat. Teddy never changes because he can't change. Because if Teddy changes, his entire world falls apart, and all the bad things that he's already done that we don't know about yet, all of those things now fall on him like a ton of bricks. And so he cannot change. So he cannot hear what Don is saying. So he says, this isn't about me. This is about everyone. One day soon, you'll see the world will know you as a hero. Not only is Teddy refusing to accept what Don is saying, but he's again using manipulation and then transitioning back to the childishness of come here, booger, right? And he gives him a hug because they're children. It lends nicely to the next scene where Don is alone now, and he's sad and confused, but he's doing research, right? He's looking at beautiful images of swirling celestial bodies on his smartphone, the cosmos, so distant and wondrous, so far away from this small and squalid life. But he can hear Michelle's weeping in the basement, and so he begins to cry, and he covers his ears because this is such a visual way of showing the conflict and the dichotomy of Don. Don is so trapped. He's the only character trapped between worlds because he loves Teddy so much, but she's weeping. But he had just told her, don't fall for her pain traps, right? Ugh. Like how hard for Don. And Don is us. Don is the audience. We're supposed to be trapped too. So now we enter our first kind of B story, our backstory for Teddy, a flashback to his mom. Many years ago, black and white, and we hear Good Morning Starshine, which is going to become a theme. Again, this song is going to play over and over as things happen in the script, in the story. And we meet Sandy, we meet Teddy's mom, and she's got all these needles in her. It's described as her body is covered in needles like a sea urchin, and Teddy is picking them out one at a time as she's talking to him. It's Teddy's job to remove the pain from his mother, these needles from his mother. It's some sort of therapy. And she's feeding him all of this conspiracy shit as he's doing this. And the first time I read this, I thought, oh man, this is a bit on the nose, right? Like she taught him how to be a conspiracy theorist, and so now he's just like taking, it's like, oh, my dad abused me, so I'm an abuser. It seemed A to B to B to C. It seemed too easy for me until she starts levitating off the ground. And then I realized that this isn't necessarily reality. I mean, clearly it's not reality, but what Sandy's saying may not have ever happened. This is Teddy's black and white distorted view of his past. This is how he sees his past. And if you've ever been involved in criminal prosecution and you talk about eyewitness testimony and how unreliable it is, it's because memory is tricky. Your memory isn't what you think it is. Your memory is what you make it. And so this is Teddy's version of his own origin story. And it's fantastical. And it's odd. And it's painful. It's not supposed to be taken literally. And that's how we get introduced to our first title card 3 days before the lunar eclipse. I consider this kind of to be like the midpoint between the beginning of Act 2A and the midpoint of the movie. So you have Act 2 is split between two parts, right? I think that's pretty common knowledge for writers now. You have Act 2A, midpoint, Act 2B. But Act 2A is still a good 25, 30 pages, depending on how long you're writing. So you got to have a split within that as well. And I think this is that split. This is where things start to escalate more and the stakes start to increase and the arcs start to progress. So what happens here? We finally cut away from the house and Teddy is on his way to work. We don't know where he works yet, but he's on his bike. He's listening to a podcast. It's a conspiracy theory podcast, which makes sense. It feeds into his, reality, and he gets pulled over by a police officer. Here is another example of Will Tracy's voice, his gravy. Something that's not needed necessarily for the story, but as a reader, I liked it. He introduces the police officer as officer, and he keeps him as officer in the character and dialogue blocks until we realize that he knows Teddy. When he says, we haven't caught up in a while since, all that shit. We know what all that shit means. But I just wanted to check on you. And then Teddy says, Casey, I'm good. What's up? So now we know that Teddy knows the officer. So the next time he speaks, he's not officer. He's Casey. So Will Tracy could have introduced him as Casey when he came out, But he wanted to keep the mystery alive of this is an officer, maybe Teddy's caught, maybe he's in trouble. But then once we know that they know each other, he's immediately Casey. It's just a nice little trick he does. It's like what he did with Don saying, young man, and then this is Teddy's cousin Don. I just like the way he introduces characters. And it's here where we start to connect the dots. The B story is immediately going to start intersecting with the main narrative, where Casey says, I think about you sometimes, not in a weird way, just, I'm grown up now. I'm a different guy. So if you ever need help, as we established before with Casey's character map and the blame shifting and the rationalization and his answer to the question, I am not responsible for the pain that I inflicted on Teddy because I was immature, because it was a power thing, whatever it is, this is where it's introduced. And Teddy, I'm good. Because he's never going to want to confront what happened to him. He's never going to want to actually deal with his issues. He's going to continue to blame others and project his anger and trauma onto Michelle and onto the world. So Casey lets him go, and then on page 36, boom, another big reveal. Where does Teddy work? Oxolith, Michelle's company. He is one of her employees. He works in the fulfillment center. And by design, they're meant to be worker bees because she's the queen bee. And this is not subtle, and I don't think it's meant to be subtle. But it's also to show status and to show how unimportant all of these people are in Michelle's world, because Tina is injured, but she can't take time off. She has to keep working. Why? Because worker bees work, and if they don't work, fuck them, they die. So Teddy takes his conspiracy talk to his workplace, but in a way that when he's using words like they and them and their, instead of aliens, he's talking about management, but he's talking about the same thing. But to Tina, it's management. He says, their machinery cut you, and you get punished for missing quotas? How's that a violation, fucking demons? She thinks he's just being, hyperbolic, but he's not. And that's kind of the poetry of the way that Will Tracy constructs these scenes and writes these scenes. It also shows that you can be more than one thing, and we talked about this before. You can be bad and be good. You can be the bad guy, but still love your cousin, right? Into the Spider-Verse does this really well. Kingpin is clearly a bad guy, but what he's doing is motivated by love for his family. Teddy truly cares for Tina. And in the next room where he has his honey and he gives it to Carlos, he clearly cares about Carlos. So Teddy's not all bad, even though he's doing terrible things even to the people he loves by chemically castrating Don. And we get this exposition dump from the reporter on TV. Again, it's another I page. Be weary of that. Be conscious of that as a writer, not to do that. But it's bringing the two worlds together now, the kidnapping and where he works. So these scenes aren't superfluous. They're not. You can't lift them out without changing what we think about Teddy. Again, that's good writing because nothing is wasted. No scenes are wasted. In a more traditional film, this would be Teddy's ordinary world, going to work and feeling this way and everything. And then that would lead to the disruption of deciding to kidnap Michelle and moving forward on that plan, because this is his status quo. But Will Tracy didn't want to waste time on all of that, so he just got into it. And that's why we had all of that, exposition talk to Don in the first act, so that we didn't have to see this first. It's actually a better reveal to show him drive up to Oxolith after we know that she's the CEO than it is beforehand. And on his way home, it's also interesting that Teddy's now listening to a self-help podcast. Self-help speak is just a different form of conspiratorial speak, which is a different form of CEO speak. The way that I write it in my notes is it's just mixing of more bullshit talk, because that's all any of this is. Everybody is saying, I have the answer, and this is the nomenclature, this is the lexicon, these are the words you use to describe your feelings or your conspiracy or your business model. And we have one little bridge scene with Don that he's been watching her. And Teddy says it's a ploy. It thinks it can pity trap our asses, but we're not going to let it. So he's once again, he's setting Don up to question reality, to question the human emotions that Michelle is showing. It's keeping him in his bedroom with his hands on his ears, not wanting to see the truth because he doesn't want to betray Teddy. So now on page 40, the danger of this scene is that it could feel like a repeated beat. If they just yell at each other again, if they just go back and forth again, how is that any different than the first time they interacted? So what does Will Tracy do? He has to escalate it. And we're seeing a change in tactic. Michelle is changing her strategies a bit. She made a recording. She admitted to being an alien in the recording. This is kind of a show of weakness, I think, for Michelle in her own mind, even though she thinks she might be controlling the narrative. But it does feel a little out of character from what she would have done in the beginning when she wakes up and she's just, in total control. So it shows a progressive change. Arcs don't happen like this, or, right? They don't happen quickly. They happen over time. And so this is a subtle change in Michelle. And you'll see subtle changes in Dawn as well, as opposed to Teddy, who never changes. So she makes the recording and Teddy doesn't believe it. And now we get our first physical escalation by Teddy. He throws the recorder and smashes it on the ground. Dawn winces. He's gone from anger to a look of rage to "you're lucky I didn't gut you" to throwing the recorder. Progressive escalation. When you feel uncomfortable, you revert back to who you are, your instincts, your original strategies. That's exactly what Michelle does here. She goes back to being the power CEO. I feel qualified here because, so I'm a chemist by training, but I also have a psych degree. That triggers Teddy. A degree? Oh my God. And Michelle, well, I do have a degree and I've also read a lot about this. And I believe you're in some kind of an echo chamber. This is the point of the back and forth where the audience is thinking these same things. The audience is thinking, man, Teddy is like, he's an incel. He's stuck in this echo chamber, right? He's on social media. He's created this narrative. And so now Michelle is telling Teddy what the audience already thinks. But what Will Tracy does is he plays against that audience expectation. And instead of having Michelle explain all this, he has Teddy explain all of this as a way of disregarding it, as a way of ignoring it. And what is it triggered by? It's triggered by Michelle, again, using a trigger word. Can we have a dialogue? Second time that she said dialogue. And there's rules of three all over this movie, right? And and I'll talk about that as Teddy's violence escalates. But rules of three. Second time we're hearing, let's have a dialogue. And Teddy says, dialogue? Don't call it a dialogue. This isn't Death of a Salesman, bitch, right? Oh, okay. Well, at least he knows what Death of a Salesman is. And Teddy goes into exactly what Michelle was going to tell him. Teddy goes into exactly what the audience thinks of him, right? We don't need to talk because I know what you're going to say. You're going to say that I'm in some kind of internet-induced auto-hypnotic feedback loop and gatekeepers and norms and all that weak hegemonic horse shit. But that is precisely the limp dick rhetoric that you've been instructed to counter the human insurgency with. That's the fucking hyper-normalized dialectic by which you have convinced 7.5 billion people that they are not your captives to keep us believing in false institutional fucking, and then he mispronounces shibboleths. And that's like when someone says to me, that's a mute point, when really what they should be saying is moot point, not mute point. And you can't help yourself but correct them, like saying, well instead of good. You're the grammar police. So Michelle corrects him, and it completely deflates Teddy, and he says whatever. And Michelle, because she reverts back to who she is and her sarcasm and cynicism, she says, oh, I guess grammar is a false Andromedan construct as well. Teddy throws a chair across the room. And Dawn flinches again, but now he doesn't just flinch, he backs up. Escalation for Dawn, escalation for Teddy. This is number 2. 2 violent acts. You had the look of rage. You had I'm gonna gut you. Then you had your first physical act, throwing the tape recorder. Now you have your second physical act, throwing the chair. That's enough to scare Michelle. And Michelle asks if it's a power thing or a sex thing, which again is a trigger because remember Teddy's past with Casey, it was a power thing, it was a sex thing. And Teddy says, no, we've been chemically castrated. Whoa! Right? Like, oh, shit! If you're Michelle, that's what you're thinking. But her response is just, Jesus Christ. These guys are fucking crazy. It could have been a big reaction. Will Tracy kept it small. And then Michelle says, Teddy, I'm sorry, but you need help. You're mentally ill. Teddy suddenly slaps Michelle in the face hard. Rule of 3. The phone, the chair, the slap. He has now physically assaulted Michelle, kidnapping notwithstanding. The kidnapping was a necessity. The slapping was a breakdown in Teddy's control, in his leverage. Michelle recoils, and so does Don. Escalation by everybody. Power dynamic shifting and escalation. On page 44, Teddy says, everybody denies it at first, but then they confess. Is this an empty threat? Is this false bravado? Is this a setup for later on? We find out what he's done in the past. The reader at this point isn't supposed to know. Michelle certainly isn't supposed to know. So is he just saying this to scare her? To scare Don? Because Don doesn't know any of this either. So they both look at Teddy kind of like, what the fuck? And then Teddy goes upstairs and Don follows. So Don's still following him, but, you know, it's getting more tenuous as the scenes progress. This is pretty intense, and Will Tracy knows this. So we need a breather. If you were eating Chinese food, you'd have a slice of orange to cleanse the palate. We have a scene now where things calm down, and we see Teddy's rendering of the spaceship, and he's talking to Don about how he figured all this stuff out, the YouTube research and all that. And it's not filler. It's meant to give you a little space to breathe before the next sequence, which becomes more intense. But within this is Teddy saying, if they won't listen to reason, I have a plan for that too. That's a setup for the suicide vest later on. Everything is planted early. Will Tracy sometimes does setup and payoff very quickly. Sometimes he does setup and payoff over time. But he always creates a mystery for the reader. Whether it's the object under the sheet, whether it's what is Teddy's backstory, what is Casey talking about, why was there diversity training, there's always a mystery that the audience is keeping in mind. And being able to track your callbacks and your setups and your payoffs, short-term, long-term, those are signs of really solid, really professional writing. And that's something that I do as a polish. I go in and I try to make sure that I pepper that stuff in throughout the entire script so that there does have this, at the end of the script when you're reading it, you're like, oh, I kind of want to read it again to pick up on all of these, little setups and payoffs. Another thing that Will Tracy does really well, that's a good takeaway for a writer, is he never forgets about what he's done in the past, what's happened in sequences prior. The chemical castration is such a big deal because of what it means for Teddy as a character and what it's done to Don, that at this point on page 46, and we're headed towards the midpoint section of the film, Don says in this scene, ever since those shots you gave me, I felt kind of weird and crazy and sad sometimes. That doesn't come out of nowhere. We need that information because we, as the audience, need to be reminded that of the three of them, Don is probably the biggest victim, even though Michelle is locked up in the basement, and that's only because he's a stand-in for us and we see him as an innocent party. Michelle, she's definitely a victim, but she's not innocent. She doesn't have clean hands. Teddy, obviously, he's our antagonist. He's our bad guy, right? And depending on how you see the ending of the movie. Don, we can't forget what happened. The chemical castration is such a big deal that if Tracy didn't come back to it, it would almost feel like it was him trying to manipulate the audience rather than him actually using it to further Don's character. And when he says it makes him sad and makes him crazy, that all reinforces Don's reluctant following of Teddy. And one more thing that Tracy does in this scene is, once again, he hints at the fact that Teddy's done this before. He says, I tried to do this diplomatically, responsibly, with standards this time. This time. This is, I don't know, I haven't been counting if it's been 3, 4, 5, how many times that he's hinted at the fact that he's done this before, but Tracy keeps doing it, but small, and in small ways that you can almost consider as throwaway lines. But then when the reveal happens and you come back again, second time, you're like, oh my, he's telling you again and again and again that he's been doing this. This is not the first time. This is an escalation of what he's done. So on page 47, we have another title card, 2 days before the lunar eclipse. This is a signal to the audience, to the reader, that something major is about to happen. Not just because it breaks up with a title card. You can think of A Quiet Place breaking up. It's, at least in the beginning, it's major sequences with title cards so that you know where you are in the story. This happens right at the start of the midpoint section, and it applies pressure on Teddy because we know that time is of the essence. He's running out of time. Michelle is running out of time. Once we hit that lunar, something has to happen, right? So it's just like that object under the sheet. It's the creating the mystery. It's the ticking clock. It's what's going to happen, and it pushes everybody towards the midpoint as an inevitable conclusion. You can think of it the same as the inciting incident moving to the Act 1 turn. Once that inciting incident happens, it has to feel inevitable to hit the lock. That's the chaos section. You have to feel like you're going down a path that the only logical conclusion is the Act 1 turn, is the lock. At this point, you have to feel like what happens next is inevitable. Otherwise, it feels random, and that's when audiences start to, when you start to lose your reader, when you start to lose your audience, because they want things to connect, and if they don't connect, they're just going to tune out. At least that's what happens with me when I watch a movie or read a screenplay. We enter this sequence with a mixture of strategies. Michelle is still trying to re-exert control. It's trying to stay in power and control. She's trying to actively escape. She's not resigned to her fate. She's trying to get out of these chains. And then they come downstairs, and Don has a shotgun. And I talk about Chekhov's gun a lot because, if you use it properly, it's always effective. It's one of those things that never gets stale. Don comes down with the shotgun. At some point in the film, we're going to have to make use of that shotgun. Same with the object under the sheet. At some point, we're going to have to make use of that object under the sheet. If we don't, it's a loose thread, and it's something that a cynical audience could look at and question, and then you have them talking about, things that aren't what you wrote on the page. You want to pay all these things off so that your message, your voice, your story doesn't get lost in the technical details of failing to pay off a setup or to do a callback or Chekhov's gun or any of that stuff. So Tracy knows what he's doing. That's why he puts shotgun in all caps. You are intended to, by design, focus on the fact that he has a shotgun. And here you have another subtle shift in arc for Michelle. And I've said that Michelle's arc is flat. I think Michelle's arc is relatively flat, even though she makes active decisions at the end that you can kind of see as a negative arc, or the fact that she changes her strategy. But the goal of her strategy, right? The goal of her changing her strategies is always to reclaim her power, which is what she ends up doing later. She reclaims her power. So this isn't a true change in worldview. It's not a change in her initial answer to the thematic question. It's just a change in strategy to try to reclaim leverage, to try to reclaim power. So here she's way more, I'm an alien. I admit it. It's not as flippant. It's not as condescending. She's trying to appeal to Teddy to tell him that he's right, and he was right all along. But Teddy has already told her and the reader and the audience that everything she says is a lie. So this never mattered. Teddy has already decided to move to the next level. So the reveal on page 48 of the electric chair bolted to the ground, that's the payoff of constantly reminding us that there's this thing under the sheet. The second that you see it, the dread hits. Not just for Michelle, but for us, for the reader, because we know Teddy's not going to back down. He's not going to change his mind, because he hasn't yet. And as he's setting her up in the chair, I think it's a nice touch here on page 49 where Teddy says, "I'm sorry, I'm a humane person and I don't want to do this." He's engaging in rationalization the same as Casey, the same as Michelle with the clinical trials. He refuses to take responsibility because his answer to the thematic question is, I can remove myself from the pain that I'm inflicting on Michelle because she's left me no choice. That is why having a thematic question is so important, because every scene, every line of dialogue, every exchange applies pressure to that thematic question, and it makes all of these decisions truly connected, not just feel connected, but they are truly connected. Now we get Good Morning Starshine, that song that was playing over his mom's flashback. That starts coming back into play here because he's playing it on this boombox. He's playing Good Morning Starshine. This gets switched in the film with, I think, a Green Day song, which I found pretty good, pretty compelling. I like it in the film. I actually don't think that Good Morning Starshine is needed in the screenplay to tie these things together. I think it's a little bit too much. I think it's a little bit of Will Tracy maybe not trusting the audience as much as he could have, because all of this makes sense without actually tying it in with this Good Morning Starshine song. But it is a good technique for writers to have a through line and to have something, a visual motif or an audio motif that connects things, because the reader sees it. The reader sees Good Morning Starshine. And even if the reader doesn't know what that song is, seeing it again and again and again makes a mental connection. It's like mind-muscle kind of connection. So when Teddy quietly says to himself, "I'm sorry, Mom, I have to do this," this is another way of him shifting the blame to society, and his apology is a fake apology. It's no different than Casey's rationalization, but humans are complicated, and Teddy is complicated, and as much as this is true and false, like I've said, you can be more than one thing at one time, and I think it's represented really nicely here. Arcs. Don's arc really starts to move here, because up until this point, he's been passively trying to resist Teddy by getting Teddy to change his mind about how he's doing things. But now he's openly saying, maybe we shouldn't do this. And then Teddy says, "She killed our family, cuzzy." That's the truth seeping out. We don't know that yet, though, right? We don't know how they're connected other than the fact that he works at Oxalith. He's saying this literally, not like he killed our family, like the bees, like humanity. He's saying it, and you have to assume that Don also knows who Michelle is. Maybe he doesn't. It's not truly clear how much Don knows. But then he starts to electrocute Michelle, and the script says he's not enjoying this. I like that Will Tracy puts that in here because he doesn't want the audience to dislike Teddy, even though he's doing this awful thing. But he also doesn't want the audience to be okay with it. And that's why Don is there. Don, Teddy, please don't. Don, you'll kill her. Don, no, Teddy. Don, please, please. Don, Teddy, stop. And on page 51, this is our midpoint explosion. But it starts with Don saying, "That's enough." Don standing up and changing his worldview, right? At least starting to change his worldview. He's not okay with this, whether she's an alien or not. It's pain and he sees it. And it's not, "Oh, I might cut her while I'm shaving her head." He's electrocuting her. And he can't, Don's humanity can't process that, and it can't be okay with it. At the top of page 51, Don dares to lay a hand on Teddy. That's how Will Tracy writes it. He writes it almost from the point of view of Teddy. He could have just said, Don puts his hand on Teddy, but he doesn't. He uses charged language, and this is really great use of prose. This is the gravy. Don dares lay a hand on Teddy, but Teddy throws him off. Teddy gives the knob one more big jolt and another scream. Teddy pushes Don away, showing what Teddy's priorities are. And it goes back to the chemical castration. He's using Don. He loves Don, but he's using him. And he doesn't have a use for him now. He's getting in his way. It's just like when he says, maybe don't talk at all. I'll do all the talking. Don's not going to get in the way of Teddy doing what he thinks is his moral responsibility. And then the big midpoint explosion, the big reveal at the bottom of page 51, after he turns off the machine. "Teddy, I wish to apologize profusely. I did not realize, Your Majesty." Continuing on page 52, "I stupidly thought you were admin." Admin. He's using CEO business terms. "I thought you were admin. I didn't realize at that voltage that you have royal genetic code." Once more, the audience is like, what the fuck is this guy's nuts? What the fuck is wrong with him? But to Teddy, this changes everything. And That's why it's the midpoint explosion. The midpoint explosion doesn't have to be a reversal or something new introduced that completely destroys the narrative of the first half of the second act. It can be a revelation that forces the characters to change their tactics or to reconsider their initial answer to the thematic question. Here, Teddy's first mission was to use blunt force and intimidation to get Michelle to introduce him to whoever's in charge. The midpoint reveal is that she's in charge. That forces Teddy to rethink how he's going about this, which is why he apologizes, and then he reverts back to that weird clinical sci-fi jargon kind of, we'll give you the night to recover. Until then, rest well. It's like another like Mr. Spock, like kind of like robotic sci-fi kind of like rest well. Like it's an interesting choice that's how Teddy decides to respond, and when he's play acting and when he's being somebody other than himself, when he's wearing that mask. And then we finally put the pieces together as we end the midpoint sequence and transition into Act 2. We go back to black and white. And now we see and we hear Good Morning Starshine playing somewhere in the distance to connect everything. And there is Michelle talking to a younger Teddy with his mother there, apologizing for this clinical trial, essentially turning her into a vegetable. It's the same bullshit, fake talk that she uses in the beginning with the diversity training. She doesn't believe any of it, but she's forced to say it. And while she's giving this fake apology, this fake, we're gonna learn from this. We're gonna get better, and your mother's pain won't be in vain. As she's saying all this, Sandy begins to float and drift away, just as she started levitating in the last flashback. A couple things here. This is not what led to the diversity training. Whatever led to the diversity training is some other awful thing that Michelle did. This is pure business, a bad decision, a bad clinical trial, a bad drug, and this is damage control for her. So she's very used to this kind of damage control, whether it's external to victims or internal to her employees. And within this monologue, this is the rule of three. This is the third time now. She says, that's a dialogue for a different day. What a great callback. So Will Tracy is using the rule of three, and he's had this, let's have a dialogue as a trigger twice for Teddy. The third time we see it, where we start to understand it, why it's a trigger, actually predated the events. So he's got the rule of three out of order, but it's still satisfying because when she says that's a dialogue for another day, as the reader, I'm like, ha 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 ha. Well done, Will Tracy, I like what you're doing there. But remember, with this being a flashback and her floating, this isn't reality, and this isn't what actually happened. This is, at least this is my read on it, this is Teddy's distorted reality. This is Teddy's distorted memory of this moment in his life, and her leaving, her floating away from who she was. She's getting away from who she was, and it's Michelle's fault. And he's the only person who can tether her to the ground. He's the only person who can keep his mother from floating away and leaving him forever, that fear of abandonment. So this is not intended to be factual. This is not what Michelle actually said in the moment. This is Teddy's false memory of what happened. But then Will Tracy does something that I don't agree with. He cuts from that black and white flashback to the basement where we're with Michelle, we're hearing Good Morning Starshine, and we have this voiceover from Teddy that she's remembering saying, you can't talk your way out of this again. I'm not a kid anymore. And then the prose says she remembers, she nods, her mind hums, and when Michelle Fuller's mind hums, great and terrible feats become possible. We don't need that scene at all. After that, we go to another title card, One Day Before the Lunar Eclipse, and that is really the start of Act 2B. We could have just gone from the flashback to the title card. This little extra scene, this is a good example for writers. If you take this scene out and throw it away, you won't be confused about what happens next. It doesn't impact what happens next. So it's not necessary. I don't think this scene needs to be in the script. But no script is perfect, and I think that's a good lesson too. There's always things that writers will disagree on, and that can be improved or not improved. Maybe you disagree with me and you think that this is an absolutely essential scene. This is the turning point of the whole movie. Who knows? Let me know in the comments. All right, so that takes us through the midpoint of Bugonia. To keep this video from getting too long, I'm going to split this up, and I'll come back for my next video, which will look at Act 2B of Bugonia, and maybe we'll even go into the third act. We'll see how long it takes. I hope you found this educational, useful, entertaining. Let me know in the comments below if I got anything wrong, if you agree with me, disagree with me. And if you like this kind of content, come back to the channel for more. Until next page, I'm Matt Weiner, and this is Fade In, a channel dedicated to the art of screenwriting.